everyone, and thanks for joining us today. We have a very exciting power hour on literacy and AAC, and I'm really thrilled to have Dr. Stephanie Spadorcia joining us today. I would describe her as an expert in literacy and AAC. I've had the opportunity to work with her with a mutual client over the past couple of years. I've learned a tremendous amount from her. And some of the parents in our community and power hours were asking for more information about how to help their school teams understand how to assess the child's literacy using AAC and how to encourage and enhance their child's literacy using AAC. So that's what Dr. Spadorcia is here to talk about today, and I'm going to let her take it away. And welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you. So I know it's usually you have informal, but I'm going to present some information. As always, I'm a teacher. I'm a teacher at heart, so I always prepared more information than maybe we can go through. And so I know that Audrey's going to make sure you all get the slides and resources so you don't feel like you have to write everything down. So I always tell my graduate students that you have the PowerPoint or you'll get the PowerPoint. So don't feel like you have to copiously write all these notes. But also please feel free to stop, raise your hand, put something in the chat. We'll make sure we have some information. I want to use your time wisely, but also feel free to, stop and ask me for clarification or information or how, a connection you're making, and then we can make sure we get through as many questions as possible. So my contact information is there, and oops, am I able to? Here we go. So let's get some terminology out of the way, because I think this would be helpful. So literacy and communication. So some of you, depending on your age, you might have learned how to read and write. There was reading time and there was writing time. And now in the last 25, 30 years, we've really had more of this term of literacy, because literacy really recognizes that it's not just reading or just writing. It's reading and writing. It's listening or incoming, right? Receptive language and expressive language, communicating, whether it's communication through speech or sign language or other means of communication. So some people say reading, writing, listening, speaking. Not everybody speaks, so I make sure to say communicating, because we all communicate in different ways. And I am a speaking individual, but I'm Italian, so I use my hands. So all my hand gestures are part of it as well. So we want to, first thing to think about when you think about your own children or the kids that you're here thinking about today are their instructional time should have dedicated time every day for reading, writing, listening, and communicating. Right? And we should have IEP goals that address those things, particularly if any of these areas are a problem. We can't just isolate them out. It might be that you have a student who has a specific learning disability, just it hits them in reading or just hits them in writing. When we think about kids with more complex needs, like I'm assuming many of you are thinking about, it's all four of the things and how they're interwoven. And they also aren't separated out. They shouldn't be separated out throughout the day. For instance, we're going to talk about AAC, and it shouldn't be that there's just one time of the day where AAC is taught and dealt with. It should be interwoven throughout the day. So reading, writing, listening, and communicating. We're going to think of these in very big terms like that. So let's get some other terms out of the way. So sometimes, depending on your state and your region of the country, these two terms, AT and AAC, are used interchangeably, but there's a difference. And you as a parent or an educator or an advocate should make sure that these things are clearly articulated in the student's plan. Assistive technology are tools that help you, right, with either daily life functioning, curriculum, in this case for school. So it could involve an alternative keyboard, an alternative mouse. It could be a slant board, right? It could be all those other devices, high tech or no tech, that support an individual to access and participate in the curriculum. Okay, so if I'm a student who struggles with using my pen, right, using a pen or paper or even typing with the keyboard, I might have a dictation device on a phone or an iPad where I can dictate what I want to say and it gets entered into a word processing program. That would be an example of assistive technology. I'm going to get the words wrong because it's 7 o'clock on the East Coast and I haven't had enough coffee, or I've had too much coffee. Okay, and I give you a link on this slide of examples of assistive technology. So we make sure that students have access to assistive technology tools so they can access the curriculum. The purpose of our night tonight is AAC and how it impacts literacy. So can you see the full slide okay, Audrey? I'm going to move my moving
Yes,
ahead.
I see everything. It looks great.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Oops. Sorry. Oh, there we go. Okay. You and your computer has a mind of its own. Augmentative and alternative communication is different. It's AAC for short. And maybe by a show of hands, how many of you here have a child in your life, or your own child, or a student that are an AAC user? I'd be interested to know by show of hands. Great, thank you. So AAC, defined by ASHA, okay, the American Speech and Hearing Language Association, defines it as any form of communication other than oral speech. Okay, so it could be technology, and there's a whole range of technology tools. It could also be gestures. In some cases, sign language is a form of AAC when it's used as part of a total AAC system. Now, someone who is deaf at birth or has a hearing impairment and uses sign language for communication, that is their language, and we recognize that as a culture unto itself and a language unto itself. But in terms of total communication for students, for an individual like the students that you're thinking about, sign language can be part of an AAC system. But it could just be things like picture communication symbols. I'll show you some pictures in a minute. It could be binders of books and photographs, right? That's really what we call low tech or no technology. It could be some simple communication systems, things that have like 3 or 4 choices on them, okay? It could be, oh, where's my box? I always have a box of AAC at the ready, right? You never know when a group of people come into your home and you need to show some AAC, right? So these are picture communication symbols. Can you see that? I don't know if it's showing up in the, okay? So most common is Mayor Johnson, and it's a great tool. It plugs into other systems, but this is a no technology picture communication symbol system. This is AAC, and it happens to go along with one particular book. This is low tech. Student would point, right? I can have things that are Velcroed, they could attach. There's lots of different ways. We can individualize it if I need to make it bigger. Same symbols, but bigger, right? For a student who might have different vision issues, but they could also be small, right? Small little icons like this that I could include and attach on a preset recording device where there might be 4 or 5 buttons, and I could attach those. So we're getting up in terms of more sophisticated technology, in terms of mid-tech, they would call that, to things like iPads, right? iPads have been one of the greatest tools for AAC in the last decade or so, because they're so easily programmable. There's systems like Proloque, Proloque to Go, which are available, easily customizable, and they use the same like picture communication symbols. And then there's very high tech speech generating devices. Think about Stephen Hawking, right? The amazing physicist, right, that we had. He spoke for a majority of his life. Once his ALS, took his ability to speech, he always had a system, an AAC system that was a speech generating device. So I know Audrey in her work probably has resources to how do you get evaluated for those kind of things. I'm just going to talk about what are the implications for instruction and so forth and things to think about. The AAC systems really range like in here in terms of no tech to high tech, but each one of them is what we need to think about is how do we use those to effectively support and model and mentor to students how to use them. And I find literacy instruction is the best way to do that, right? So it's not a either or, it's reading, writing, listening, and communicating all together. That is what literacy is. And using these different systems, whether it's picture communication symbols on Velcro, like I just showed you, or a more high-tech system, opportunities to engage with the world and communicate during literacy instruction often is the most motivating. We get the most effect in measurable increases in students' abilities with rich literacy instruction. Often, unfortunately, it's an either or. It's until they've mastered their AAC system, they're not accessing literacy curriculum, or they can't read, so therefore we can't teach them how to write. And so we really want to try and tease that apart. So this is a slide I actually added at the last minute Audrey, so I could email this to you. So I'm going to come back to this. So in a traditional view of literacy readiness, right, literacy is predetermined. I'm not sure the age of everyone on this call, but if you were a child in the 70s like I was, we learned how to read first, and then come third grade, we then learned how to start to write. Because the assumption was, and some of you might even have that after the fact, that you can't learn how to write until you've mastered reading. Right? It also is very much that literacy learning is school-based, right? That it's what you do with Mr. Jones or Mrs. Smith in your classroom. It's not what we do to access our world, right? To read and write about the things that are so important to us and interact with our world. And we used to say a lot of times that they're pre-reading, right? I don't use that term. I haven't used it for a long time, as well as my colleagues, because pre-reading assumes there's a set of prerequisite skills, like joint attention, like matching, like all those things that you have to master in order to qualify, to get an AAC system, which is wrong. That's a AAC system will change over time, but AAC system is a civil right, and access to literacy instruction. Cannot wait until you've mastered your AAC system, right? We haven't mastered a speaking child, a child who uses speech for primary communication. We don't wait to teach them to read and write until they've learned how to read Shakespeare, right? That's not what we do. And right, I have lots of relatives who don't speak very clearly, and they've learned how to read and write. So we really have to make sure that we are advocating for that we're teaching reading, writing, listening, and communicating together, and it's a development that occurs over time. And effective literacy instruction is one of the best ways we're going to get at AAC proficiency. So in that traditional model, first kids learn how to listen. So a baby is born, and they hopefully are born with the ability to hear. Okay, then they start to babble, and they learn how to talk. This is a traditional model. Okay. After you've mastered speaking, you go to school, so kindergarten, right? You start to learn how to read. You know your letters, you know your sounds, and then after you've mastered reading, then we teach you how to write. But this is an exclusionary model. Many of you probably have individuals in your lives where full communications through speaking, that second box up, they wouldn't be able to learn how to read and write if we followed this model, right? That would exclude them from access to instruction. So instead, we like to talk more, my colleagues and mentors in the field, that a more current view is what we call an emergent literacy model. And Teal and Sulsby really gave us that model for talking about typical literacy development, neurotypical literacy development. But my colleagues in the field, we have applied that for years. There's decades of research to show how it applies to kids who are neurotypical, kids who have a variety of disability situations. And it doesn't mean just a young child. So the student that Audrey has referred to a few times we have in common, that young man is a teenager, and he is leaving the emergent literacy stage of development. Okay, so it's not just a reference to the young baby or the young toddler or the kindergartner that could sit on your lap and read a book with you. It is really about the development of reading, writing, listening, and communicating all at the same time. That oral language and written language development are occurring simultaneously. And notice the arrows going in all different directions. That's very different than that building block model that I presented just one slide ago. That for some students, especially our AAC users, writing develops first. Writing is the first place they're going to show us progress. They're going to show us the ability to attend. They're going to give us something that we can measure and build on in terms of literacy instruction. Because reading development, traditionally, we think of it as until you can show me you can orally read. I don't know if you're reading. Well, a lot of students can't orally read. And a lot of people won't be able to show us oral reading development, but they still go on to read and comprehend, right? So we're going to talk through a model in a few minutes of what reading instruction should include and what are the skills we want to build. And then I do have some like IEP objective examples to share that we're going to give you as a resource so you can start to advocate for those with your own children, okay? And the students that you're here to think about. So I want to make sure I'm stopping. Is there any thoughts or questions? So let's talk about what is it we should be shooting for in terms of the reading part of the literacy model, okay? So notice at the top of the screen here, it's in red, just the way my visual is. It's silent reading comprehension, right? That should be the goal or a goal on every student's IEP. Audrey, my student, Audrey will read silently with comprehension. One level higher than she is right now. If we don't have any identifiable ways that we know if she's silently reading, we're going to get her to do some of the skills that I'm going to highlight in just a few minutes. But that should be our goal. You could look at your own children's IEPs right now, and if all the goals are just about prerequisite skills, then you don't have your eyes on the prize. The prize is silent reading comprehension. Okay? All of us, I want every student to be able to read independently, silently with comprehension. Underneath that are 3 sets of sub-skills that we're going to talk about, okay? The first is word identification, and this is where we as a field, as a special educator particularly, we spend a ton of time here. We have more ways to teach this and to test it than any other thing. But it's also often a place where we then exclude kids from getting to the big red area at the top of the screen. Because we say, well, until I know that he or she can read and write, until they're able to do that, how can I get to comprehension? Whereas word identification is one set of skills that support reading comprehension. I like to think of it like as a table, right? The top of the table is silent reading comprehension, and there's 3 legs that support it. And word identification is a very important leg of the table. The other leg of the table, they're all equally important, but language comprehension, the area that's in yellow, that is your receptive language. That is your ability to listen to me right now and understand what I'm saying. So if I was reading to you, if I took out a book and read to you about this model, right, you would be using your language comprehension skills to listen to oral language being read out loud to you. Like if you listen to a book on tape, an audio book. Right now, you're using your language comprehension skills for, and I'm just talking, right? Talking to you. So for a long time in the field, we used to think one of 2 things based on our preconceived notions of how a disability was impacting a learner. We would say they're either going to be a phonetic reader, they're going to just sound out words, that's the orange leg of the table, or they're just going to be read to. We're just going to have to read to them, and that's the language comprehension. We know both occur. We know both need to be developed. And regardless of your disability label, whether you have had a brain injury, whether there's been surgery, whether there's a developmental disability, whether there's autism, whether you're an English language learner, right? Even if there isn't a disability situation, it's just language and cultural difference, or a student with a mild learning disability, let's say. We know both set of skills have to develop and both occur in order for the big area on the top, the silent reading comprehension, to develop. The last leg, that bottom area, the green, just visually, I just put it at the bottom. It's called print processing beyond word identification. What that means is it's not about words in isolation. So how many of you probably have children in your lives who their word instruction involves reading one word at a time on a list or on an index card or something like that? Melinda, I see you shaking your head. Students can never get beyond individual word identification without developing print processing. Print processing is your ability, right, to read a book, to be able to look at a book, whether it's on paper, well, that has nothing on it, right? Whether it's paper or it's an electronic means too. But you're able to actually track print. You're able to actually start at the top left-hand corner, the way conventional English is written. Stop top left-hand corner, go left to right, and keep track of your lines and go down from there, right? So we all know children in our lives probably, they get so excited when they read their first book that has more than 1 line per page, right? Like, oh, I'm reading a multi-sentence page. They don't say multi-sentence, but they get excited because that's about tracking print, right? we're going to go into each area in a little bit more depth and make some connections to some instructional things you should be asking for and some how we can assess these things, particularly in our AAC users, okay? But all three areas need to be developed, and there needs to be dedicated time in a student's literacy program, in their IEP, right? Word identification is obviously word study, phonics, whatever you want to call it. Language comprehension is comprehension. It's how to read and understand. And print processing is independent access to books. Right? So often I work with teams, and when we look at a student's day between related services, right, related therapies, the thing we push aside first is independent reading time because we don't have time for it, or it's such a challenge, right? Or they just rely on parents or guardians to do it at home. And okay, if a team has to make that decision, then you should talk about that. But when is the student having opportunities and access for print processing or independent reading time? Okay, so let's look at these in more detail. Word identification, there's two parts, two sets of skills we have to develop, okay? The first one is automatic word recognition, or automaticity. You as a parent or a teacher might call this sight words. Call these sight words, okay? When you know a word by sight, you know it in less than a quarter of a second, okay? Now, the original research done on that was done with typically developing readers. We know that for a word to become a word you know by sight, you have to have anywhere from 7 to 14 exposures to it across time, not 7 to 14 in a row. 7 to 14 exposures across time for it to become a word you know by sight. So therefore, the students that we're here thinking about this evening, this afternoon, we assume it's more than 7 to 14 exposures because we know if there's been trauma to the brain, if there has been significant surgery, if the impact of the epilepsy is affecting them, if there's memory issues, we know that it's more exposures, but they still have to get the skill. They still have to have opportunity to learn that skill. It's not going to happen at the same pace, but it still needs to happen. So you want to make sure when you're thinking about your student, your child's IEP, when in the day are they teaching automaticity of words and how, okay? And how are they measuring it? We can talk about that. The next area is mediated word identification. Mediation is decoding, or phonics, or word attack, or sounding it out, whatever you like to call it, okay? Mediation relies on two sets of skills. The first one is, so I'm reading a word. So when you saw Audrey's email about this event, the Power Hour, right? And you saw my name, chances, I don't think I've met any of you before, right? So you looked and went, well, I'm going to hear some woman, her name is Stephanie. I'm not sure how to pronounce her last name. And that's okay. No one does, right? Unless you come from my little corner of the world, where if you come to Quincy, Massachusetts, everyone has my family's last name, but that's it, outside of here in Italy. So you looked at Stephanie and said, oh, Stephanie was an automatic word for you. You knew it in less than a quarter of a second. You actually didn't even process every individual letter, believe it or not. But my last name's Spadorcia, not so much, right? You looked at it, maybe you tried to sound it out, and you said, well, I'm not going to say her name anyway, so I won't have to pronounce it well, or you wait for Audrey to do it. But you weren't able to successfully mediate or decode my name because you never heard it before, because it isn't in your receptive vocabulary. So if you've never heard a word before, it's hard to mediate or decode it. That's why communication, right here, communication, opportunities to have increased receptive vocabulary, opportunities to experience the world, opportunities for helping narrate your child's life or your student's life, or those of you that are caretakers. It's so important to build that receptive vocabulary bank that's in their head so that they can start to hear words, and when they have to decode it, go, oh, that's the word, okay? So how many of you remember when the first Harry Potter book came out? Right, when Harry Potter came out in the late 90s, and the little girl in the book, right, her name, right? So how many of you had, when you read it, had your own pronunciation in your head? And then you went to the movie and went, oh, that's not how I said it, right? I know I called her Hermione. That was what I called her when I read the book out loud. When I read the book to myself, excuse me. And then when I saw the movie and I heard them say out loud Hermione, I was like, oh, so now that name is a sight word for me. And I say it Hermione because that's how I heard it over and over times, right, in the book, in the movie, right? And it supported my reading of the book. So if you've never heard a word before, it's really hard to have that decoding or mediation match of, oh, like that, oh, that's that word. So if your child is in a science class and they're engaged in science content, we want to make sure they see the word, they hear it, right? And they have access to be able to look at it, have it on their AAC system. So if they're studying sedimentary rock, I want to make sure they see the word sedimentary as I'm saying it out loud to them so they can have the visual match with the sound match. And I'm encouraging them to say it, even if they have disordered, like dysarthric speech, right? But I'm encouraging them, can you say this word, sedimentary? Can you say it in your head? Right? So I'm matching up their receptive vocabulary to what they're seeing. So when they read that word in print, they're more likely to be able to successfully mediate it. Okay? Successful mediation for speaking individuals, I'm going to talk about speaking individuals for a minute, often relies on phonemic awareness. You've probably all heard that term as parents or teachers and caregivers. Phonemic awareness. Phonemic awareness is your ability to listen to sounds and be able to isolate individual sounds in spoken language, in this case English. Okay. The interesting thing is, if you're non-speaking, okay, you can't always show phonemic awareness, right? I can't show you that I have phonemic awareness. There's tons of research to still show that I'm still going to be able to successfully decode, even if I can't show you phonemic awareness, because oftentimes those students, we encourage the visual patterns of the words, looking at the visual word while we're saying it and chunking it or breaking them up into parts, but not down to the individual sound, okay? So if you have a child in your life and they're saying, well, they haven't mastered phonemic awareness, we can't get them to score on a phonemic awareness test, doesn't mean they're not going to learn how to sound out words. Doesn't mean they're not going to learn how to read words, okay? So these two parts here, automaticity is knowing a word by sight, and mediation is being able to sound it out or decode it, even if we don't hear you decode it. Even if I don't hear you say sedimentary, okay? It's still supporting the orange leg of the table, right over there on the left side of your screen, word identification, because that's what's supporting the development of silent reading comprehension. We want word identification to be so quick and efficient that it supports comprehension and it doesn't slow you down, okay? The next leg of the table is language comprehension. This is the one we want the strongest when kids come to school. So I know we have a range of children that some of you are thinking about. I heard in Audrey's information for those that register, we anywhere from young kids to middle schoolers, right? So some of you have a 13-year-old. I have a 14 and 12-year-old at home, so I feel the pain. But language comprehension is huge, right? I'm sure all of you have an SLP involved in your child's life or have had at some point, right? Related to how their disability is impacting them. Knowledge of language comprehension for this part, we're really talking about two specific things. Knowledge of the world, which is background knowledge, prior knowledge. Your schema is another educational jargon word we like to use. That means how everything is organized. So if I say the word, spaghetti, what else comes to mind for you? If I say the word dog, you might think of your own dog, right? Your knowledge of the world is your background knowledge, and that's what you as parents have been doing since the moment your children were born, right? You have been narrating their lives, giving them rich experiences, reading to them, talking with them, taking them on family trips, just a trip down the street to the playground, whatever it is that's part of your daily life, and giving them language for it. So you're modeling language, you're talking with them, you're communicating in whatever modes of communication they communicate with you in. And so we want that, your receptive vocabulary, that knowledge of the world, to be really high, right? Now, for some students, particularly if there's been, right, injury to the brain, if they're, for whatever reason, I like to think of it sometimes as their file cabinet with everything they know about the world. Some days the file cabinet's not organized. Some days they can't open that file cabinet, right? You know that you had this experience. You took them on a family trip to a farm, or you went and got ice cream, and you have pictures of doing all these things. And then the next day it's time to talk about it, and they can't communicate about it, right? But you know it's in there. So it's really important that comprehension instruction occurs where we're accessing background knowledge for every single lesson. And it can't just be, I give it to you. Here's what you need to know about frogs. Here's 5 things about frogs. Let's go. I have to, as a teacher, help you unlock your file cabinet and find a file that connects to whatever it is I'm reading. That becomes really, really important. So I can connect to the knowledge of the text structures. You can think about knowledge of text structures as understanding written language, right? Understanding written language. This is, for many children, this language comprehension, this is all going to be received, learned, developed, whatever verb you want to use here, through reading out loud to your children. Every time you have read to your child or the children in your lives, whether you're sitting in front of a classroom or they're sitting on your lap or you're sitting next to them in their bedroom at night, you have been working on this leg of the table. And we need to make sure that that continues, right? Because that's how they're getting lots of examples of communication, knowledge of the world, written language, how written language works. Think of how a book works differently than, right, me just speaking to you right now, right? Maybe I am pretty boring, but I'd be pretty boring if I was just reading out loud to you, right? I'm using oral language instead of just reading written language to you. The last leg of this table, okay, is this print processing. And there's a lot here, and I'm just going to highlight a few things, okay? First off is eye movements, okay? So the first question to make sure, and I'm sure many of you already know the answer, if your child has a visual impairment, like I need my glasses, especially this time of night, make sure you have an updated vision test, right? That's an important thing, because obviously if I do not have the right corrective lenses, or a functional vision test where maybe this background is too difficult, right? You all know some students where you might need the black background with yellow letters, or things have to be outlined. A great benefit of, I live here in the Boston area, and I often send students to the Perkins School for the Blind for a functional vision assessment. So I'm sure Audrey has resources or connections and information, but ask for a functional vision assessment, because that really helps us understand, for instance, what the font should look like in their book. So this font I would never give to kids. Sorry, adults, right? This is not a good font for kids. I see Christine shaking her head, right? This is just for me to have my fancy PowerPoint. But I would have a nice, clean, like Comic Sans kind of print, right? And depending upon what I knew about your vision or your perception, I might have a different background, right? I might have a black background or a blue background, or it would be outlined, those kind of things. Because ultimately what eye movements are is my ability to not only track print, but to perceive 3 to 4 and then 4 to 5 words at a time. So when you and I, as a good reader, are reading a book, again, you just pick up a book and read it, you're actually not looking at every individual word. You're looking at 4 to 5 words at a time. The only way to get better at eye movements is to have access to lots of print you can read. So even if we have to technologically manipulate the print, put it in PowerPoint, there's so many electronic tools now, book reading tools on iPads, right? Other things where I can make the print bigger, make the spaces between. If that's what your child needs, we have to get it to a point where they can be independent. So in theory, they don't even have to point to the words to read, that they're able to move their eyes to be able to perceive the individual perceive the individual words. The other 2 things I want to point out are on the right side of the screen here: projecting, prosody, and inner speech. This is very important for our AAC users, who are one of our big focus for tonight, right? Prosody is using your voice to convey the meaning of a text. So if I just said, "Hey, Audrey, great job," my voice is sort of flat. But if I said, hey, Audrey, great job, my voice lets you know, ooh, she hit it out of the park. But what if I said, hey, Audrey, great job? My voice says something very different. Well, we use those different voices when we're silently reading. Notice the silent reading comprehension hasn't gone away at the top at all, right? That's why we read to our children, or teachers hopefully read to our children, right? So we can model good reading, reading with expression, reading with meaning, so that we can do the inner speech, which is right below that if you're looking at my screen. Inner speech is the most important thing we have to identify and recognize for our non-speaking or non-traditional communicators with voice. Inner speech is actually while I'm silently reading. So if I pick up this book and read it right now to myself, silently, you're not going to hear me, right? But what's actually happening is my eyes are perceiving the print, and my voice box in my throat is neurologically recoding print into speech. That's actually inner speech. So they did this research. Don't do this with your children. I say that with sarcasm. I say this all the time to my grad students, my teacher candidates, and they look at me like this professor is really off a rocker, which I might be. But they did this research back in the 60s where they put needles in people's throats while they were reading, electrodes, right? And they measured the vibrations of their voice boxes while they were reading. Their mouths weren't moving, but the needles were firing away. So all of us as proficient adult readers, when we are reading something, our voice box is neurologically firing away, and we're not aware of it if it's easy things. We become aware of our voice box and we slow down when it's a hard text. Like if you were going to read a technical manual about something, or you got a legal letter in the mail from the IRS, right? Or something that was challenging, you're going to stop. You're going to become very aware of, you are hereby notified. Like everything is going to slow down so you can process it to the point you might actually have to read it out loud to understand it, right? So your speech goes in or out based on the difficulty of the text. So you're going, why are you talking about this? I have an AAC user. He or she does not use their voice to communicate. They did the same parallel research with people who were born without the ability to hear at birth. So always had a hearing impairment, right? These people always had, they were deaf at birth, and they were native sign language users. That was their primary mode of communication. They put electrodes in their wrists and made them hold bowling. Those bowling balls you put your fingers in, like the 3 fingers? They made them hold the bowling balls while they read something. Their wrists fired away the whole time. They were recoding print into their communication, which is sign language. So why are we talking about this for our AAC users? There's so much research to show that we need to encourage our AAC users. I'm going to read this to you. I want you to read this in your head, right? I'm going to read this with you. Even if they make some sounds, that is okay. That actually supports this inner speech. So there's a gentleman in the field of AAC. His name is Rick Creech, and he himself was born with cerebral palsy. He's a speech-language pathologist that specializes in AAC. And he grew up in Appalachia, North Carolina. And he talks about the voice that he hears in his head when he's reading, that inner speech, is his mother's. Because his mother read to him his whole life. Christine, and as a mom, you're like, because she's like, he's in there, my son is in there, and I'm going to read to him. So it's really, really important to make sure we read to kids and then encourage them. I worked with a young girl several years ago in a team, and she had some speech, but it wasn't always clear. So we would, in the kindergarten classroom that we were supporting her teacher in, like if they were doing like a chart reading, like today was yellow day, Christine likes yellow M&Ms, Melinda likes yellow flowers, right? Whatever it is. We would then read it like her. Her little name was Peetsy. She was so cute. Her father was Pete, and he wanted a boy, so we named his daughter Peetsy, right? Of course. So we read it like this. Peetsy likes yellow M&Ms. Let's read it like Peetsy. So it obviously, and then of course, it was an inclusionary practice to support that the student didn't use typical speech to communicate and help these other children accept her and not be afraid and scared and all those things. But it was also helping every kid in that class develop inner speech. That when you do that, you're still saying the words in your head, right?
Can I interject really
Sure.
quick? There was
Sorry.
one comment in the chat, and I think you're going to get here. But Pam said, my son is nonverbal and is limited in AAC usage, but last year he told his speech therapist, want to read. And she and I understood it as he wants to learn to read. Unfortunately, his teacher didn't know how to go from there to teach him.
Okay.
I know, I'm sure this is where you're headed, but I just wanted to put that out there.
Well, of course, it's also the $1,000,000 question, and we need many more power hours, right, to ask for that. So if you, maybe I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a minute. Stop sharing for a second. Okay, so where do we start with that question? So we have to first advocate for that ability to be master with AAC is not a prerequisite to learn to read and write. And so that is one thing. I would encourage, so one of the slides I put together here.
And I can make you host again if you can't reshare, just let me know.
Yeah, nope. So I'm putting a website there. So if you haven't already, so this is where I did my doctorate 22 years ago. I finished that. But my colleagues are still doing so much important work at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, the Center for Literacy and Disability Studies. There are case studies, there's examples, there's so many great things that are on that website for you to help make the argument. You shouldn't have to make an argument, but make the case of why your child can and will learn how to read. The other is this website here. One of my colleagues and mentors in the field, a woman who also did her doctorate there many years ago, Carolyn Musselwhite, the AAC intervention website that I just put in the chat. Mm-hmm. I encourage you to look at those. Those are just very hands-on, practical. She's got just pages and pages of practical resources. So for a teacher who's like, okay, I want to do this, I don't know where to start, okay, that would be some resources, okay. Oh my goodness, let me go back to.
And just putting my advocacy hat on for a minute for the parents. Sure. There is a section of the IEP under the supplemental aids and services that includes training for school personnel. And there's also training for parents. So the mutual client that Stephanie and I had, he was a 9th grader. He had been given an AAC device in kindergarten and his parents had never been taught how to use it. So the IEP team is required to teach the parents how to use the AAC device to communicate with their child. You can ask for that. And then if the school team says, I don't know how to teach a child with AAC, then you need to ask them for training, for the teacher to be trained in how to teach the child. They have the right to access the curriculum that their peers access, period. And that was just reinforced in a recent Supreme Court case called Andrew F. It's like Andrew, but the first name is an E. And you can look that up to find some talking points. I think it's understood.org. I'll send you that in the links. But basically, you have a right to say, my child needs to access the grade level curriculum. And how are you going to do that? And if they don't have a good answer, it's possible that they are violating your child's right to what's called FAPE, or a free and appropriate public education. And then you come to Power Hour and you can ask me how to help you with that. But just so you know, you can ask for teachers to be trained. You can ask for training as a parent to learn how to use AAC so you can communicate with your child.
And I find so many teachers, they'll be the first to say, yes, I just don't know where to begin, or I haven't been taught or trained, right? So at least I know in the teacher education program that I run at my university, so Massachusetts requires at least 10 hours of clinical work in AAC for all special educators in the state of Massachusetts. That's one thing. You have to have at least 10 hours of experience with AAC as part of your coursework and so forth. So you're not going into a school setting without any access to it, or having no experience with it. So you want to ask the question, who in my school has the most AAC experience? It might be the assistive tech person. It might be the speech language pathologist. There might actually be a local AAC team from a university or clinic setting. Like I know I'm working with some families in Delaware right now, and there's an AAC project in the state of Delaware, and they'll come out and work with schools and so forth. So find out, I'm trying to remember all the locations people are, but there's definitely got to be some through the closest hospital setting or children's hospital setting where they will do that. If then there's the whole getting access to an AAC evaluation, and have it also include how will this tool be used in the curriculum, right? Make sure it's not just here's the tool, you're on your own, right? And a good AAC evaluation would not include that at all, but it should include how are they going to use this in the day? How are they making recommendations? And teachers need common planning time. So I'm going to put on my teacher hat. If I want to do well by your child, I need to sit with this person who's the expert in the tool and say, these are my goals for today's lesson is going to, or this week's, literacy instruction is going to look like this. These are my instructional goals. How can I use this AAC system to help the student be able to model and demonstrate those things? And it takes time. So like even with the student that Audrey and I are working on, we've been very careful to not overwhelm the right parents, rightfully so, wanted everything up and running day one, which they had every right. And I understand as a parent, but if we did everything at once, it would have been overwhelming and we wouldn't have made the progress I think we have. So now we're unpacking writing in more detail. So taking on one thing at a time. In the, you might have to let me
Make you the host again. Okay, hang on. I'm going to make you the host. You should be able to share now.
So this is a document you'll receive from Audrey, okay, where not that you would have every single one of these on an IEP, that would be too many. So we often think about if you have a child, I shouldn't say young, I'm so used to saying that, a child who's at the emergent level, even if they're 15, right? So we talk about building concepts about print, how books work, lots of reading and writing with them, opportunities for them to have exposure to print. This would be a bank of like IEP goals and objectives we could use to support to make sure there's targeted things. I really like to have objectives written that match the instruction that's going on. So for instance, student will indicate when to turn the page while reading. Right? So if I'm reading to my son, you're going to get a copy of all this. If I'm reading with my child, them showing me when it's time to turn the page, whether they actually turn it, whether they give me a head nod, whether they say no, whether they make a noise, a vocalization. That's letting me know they know how books are working. I've got some data here now, right? If they can browse and select a book for independent reading time. Right? Too often than not, don't let this be, sorry. If I hear one more time, oh, but they just ripped the books up, then buy more. Then laminate them, right? And so we do lots of things at the Literacy Center where to make books, hopefully they're on iPads or things like that too, so you don't have to worry about that. But this is a book. There's nothing great about this book. It just comes from a simple reading curriculum. But you'll notice the pages are laminated, right? This hard laminate. Try and rip this apart. If the kid that does, they've got good hand, right, gross motor skills. I'm proud of that. But I also can wipe it down. We also could put, I just don't have a copy here at home with me. I could, in this book in the corners, put a little piece of soft Velcro or a page puffer, and that helps, right? Hands that have a hard time turn the pages. We've even done things like where in the book, each page, I put a popsicle stick here, sticking out so they can use their hands. If they have a head pointer or a grabber of some sort, another assistive technology tool, they can turn. We need lots and lots and lots of books. Your typical first grade classroom, so a first grade classroom that is teaching kids how to read and write and doing it effectively has 20 different books per kid. 20 different titles. Mm-hmm. They might have 20 copies of each one of those 20 books. What we also know is that, so if the typical classroom has at least 20 different titles per kid that they can read. And sometimes a book is like chart paper on the wall. It could be notes the kids write to each other, right? Those kind of things. Your first grader, I keep saying typical, trying not to use that word. Your first grader who leaves first grade learning how to read, right? I always go, what do they have? What do they have access to that I need to advocate for the kids that I'm concerned about? They have access to 17 different pieces of print a day they can read. So a morning message that the teacher writes is a piece of print, a magazine, an iPad book, okay? Kids with disabilities, especially more significant disabilities, have access to less than one. That's just the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, right? In terms of access to print. So start with books, right? Because the first thing a teacher is going to say is, okay, I want to teach them. I don't have enough books that are, especially if they're a fifth grader and they are still reading at a first grade level. We need books. There are books out there. There's curriculum. There's different things out there, and all have some value.
Mhm.
There's some that work better than others. So the rest of this, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I don't know if you're going to get to this, but there's a question about the difference between teaching and showing comprehension. And I interrupted you as well because, when you talk about like, there's fewer text options for the child with a disability. There's also less time generally for literacy instruction in a child's day because they're pulled out of a gen ed literacy time for therapy, for example. Yeah. And one of the things that Dr. Spadorcia has taught me is that a child who's significantly behind in their reading needs something like 90 to 120 minutes a day.
90 minutes
the day.
2 hours, yeah.
Yeah, and she's going to tell you about how that would look. So I'd like you to answer the question about teaching versus showing comprehension. And you also talked about how writing can come first. So and I had never thought about writing in the way you talk about writing. So would you talk a little bit about what writing looks like for a young child who's an AAC user and how that would come first?
I'm going to stop this so we can have more conversation. So you'll get it. Okay. So we need 90 to 120 or so, up to 2 hours of literacy instruction is what you should be shooting for in your child's day. It doesn't have to be continuous. It could be 30 minutes in the morning, 20 minutes here. It could also be some of it is done with the speech language pathologist, right? Or things like that. So but again, in order to learn how to read and write, I like to just, for ease of time, break it up into 4 blocks of time. There needs to be word study time, comprehension instruction time, writing, and independent reading. So I'll put those in the chat here. Words, comprehension, writing, and independent reading.
And the independent reading, like I know with our mutual client, that could maybe be done at home with a family if there really isn't enough time in the day. I know a lot of parents are willing to commit, but with the guidance of what would that look like, and the parent has to be trained in how to use the device and how to guide the student and what literature they should be reading or what text they should be reading so that it can be collaborative and they can be part of that educational experience. It's not random.
Right. And as a parent, you should feel like you should be reading with your child for enjoyment, right? So I'm going to go back to that screen just because I think it helps set a context for some instructional things here. Again, we could have a whole other time just to show some videos and some examples and so forth. Maybe we could do that down the road, Audrey. So when engaged in a shared reading activity, so that's you reading with your child or a teacher or another adult reading with your child, they will use their AAC system, voice output device, whatever their tool, or just their voice, to be able to read the repeated line in the book. So we all know the classic book, Brown Bear, what do you see? If they can tell me that line, if they can indicate it's time to read that line, they're comprehending. They're with me on that book, on that page, right? If they can tell me what happened first, the dog ran away. And maybe they're just going to say ran, right? Maybe they're just going to use one word, either verbally, sign language, or with their AAC system to let me know they understood that the dog ran away. That's what happened next in the book, right? Maybe they're going to make a prediction. What do you think's going to happen next? Right? And you're given some wait time as a teacher, wait time as a parent. For you as a parent, it should be very conversational and fun. As a teacher, we do things more set up in an instructional context, right? Maybe they're going to relate to, I'm going to ask them to relate. We're going to read this book about dogs. I want you to read to find a dog that you think you've seen before, right? So I'm setting the context of why we're reading this book together, okay? Or this passage or whatever it is that we're reading, okay? I know I also have here some writing connections filled in. Where am I here? So while writing, right? So our young writers, developmental young writers, even if they're older, if they're 13-year-olds or 15 or 16-year-olds, writing when you're still learning how to write oftentimes is a combination of scribbling or what appears to be random letters on a keyboard, or random letters that they pick magnetic letters. So if you go to that UNC website that I gave you, you're going to see something called the Writing with Alternative Pencils. I really encourage you to take a look at that. Writing with alternative pencils is this notion that your child, your student has something they want to say. They're unable to use a pen or paper, or they're unable to use a keyboard because of motor skills, because of motor planning, or they haven't developed it yet. But they can dictate or communicate through their AAC system something they want to say, right? So they want to tell me about, so one of the examples on the UNC website that always makes me laugh is just so cute. It's called a strategy is called a remnant book, like one strategy. So I'm going to put that in the chat. And you can find examples of remnant books for writing instruction online, where you take a book, and like a journal book that you can find at the drugstore or something like that, and glue or tape in Ziploc baggies, right? Sandwich bags. And you send in with your child photographs or items. So this, like things from if they took a trip this weekend and they picked out a bracelet and they put the bracelet in the bag, that's a remnant. A ticket stub to a movie is a remnant, right? A seashell, anything. So this one example that's on the UNC website, this young boy sent in a dead bug. Because they woke up one morning and there was a big giant dead bug on the floor of the house, and the mother screamed, and that was very memorable to him, as it would be for any young person, right? My mother screaming. So they put the bug in the Ziploc bag, zipped it up, and sent that in, and he wrote that day about the big giant dead bug in the kitchen. Now, his writing didn't say the big giant dead bug in the kitchen. It was a combination of letters that he pointed to, and his teacher, who acted as his alternative pencil, wrote it for him. And over time, we go from seeing, like with the students that Audrey and I have in common, we go from just random letters, A, to maybe AJ, and then AJM, and then letters and words start to get strung together. There's a great tool. So if you look up, and there's so many resources I could have shared for this power hour.
Oh, I'm going to share them all. You just tell me, and they'll end up in the resources I send.
Okay, so my colleague Janet Sturm, who's at Central Michigan University, has something called the Developmental Writing Scale. And that is a great assessment tool that's a continuum of writing development, from random little scribbles to words and sentences and eventually paragraphs. So it gives you a tool as a team to say, my child is a writer. Right now he's at the emergent stage. And he might put just some scribbles, or he might actually, or she might select some letters. Okay. So one of your best tools as a parent, I suggest, is like a binder of pictures, whether it's electronic or an actual physical binder, that you're constantly sending in photos of your child and the people in their lives, and give the teachers some words, some key vocabulary, like this is our dog Ollie. This is our trip to Vail, like whatever it is, so they have a little bit of context so they can support the language development. Say, do you want to write about that? What do you want to say? So when they select the letter V, oh, is this about your trip to Vail? That is fabulous. So you interpret that one letter V as Vail, and over time, because we're assuming competency, we're assuming there's intentionality in their writing, it grows the writing so much over time.
That's so exciting. I want to go back to the question because I think this was kind of a key question
Okay.
Melinda had about, and it's echoed in Christine's question too, about assessment and determining, like measuring progress. And so I know that Melinda, I don't know if you want to chime in because I'm not sure I'm going to paraphrase your question correctly, but it was about wanting to use oral reading fluency and then saying, well, he doesn't have that, so therefore we can't move on. And then Christine, you had also asked, like, how do you measure comprehension versus teaching comprehension? And I would like to also share your other comment, Christine, after she answers, if that's okay. Okay. Can you address that a little bit about how the teacher is saying, well, they can't show me that they know that, so we can't move on? Oh, I think she froze. Uh-oh. No, we were just getting to the good stuff.
Yes.
Come back. Oh no. Okay, let me text her and let her know she froze. Maybe she can restart. Shoot. All right, I'm going to pause the recording real quick. Recording.
So
The question was about assessment, both oral reading fluency and then comprehension.
okay, can you see what I just put in the chat? Is that showing up? So those are some good words you could use as a parent. So oral reading fluency. So you and I, okay, so I'm Audrey, you are an oral, you're a speaker. You use speech for communication. Oral reading fluency is a correlate of my overall reading comprehension, that thing that was at the top of my thing, okay, my slides. All that research, it comes from speaking individuals who do not have epilepsy, who do not have, right? So for speaking neurotypical individuals, getting an oral reading fluency measure of me for 1 minute lets you know how I am as a reader. Like if you go to a mechanic and they have you check your car, they do a dipstick of your oil. Doesn't mean your car is working perfectly, but it gives an indication that your engine's got enough fuel in it, right? It's got enough oil in it. Or like if you go to the doctor and they check your blood pressure, right? If my blood pressure is high or my blood pressure is low, it doesn't tell me why it's high or low. It just tells me something's off. So, but it doesn't mean, hi there. Oh, what a cutie pie. Look at those eyes.
Hi. Someone's getting ready for bed.
Yeah. So it's a correlation of it. It doesn't mean it's the only way we can measure. Okay. So a thing that's equally correlated with overall reading comprehension, okay, is doing what we call a maze activity. So oftentimes, so a maze activity or a close activity. I'm typing it in the chat for you. So that's where, do you remember Mad Libs? Remember what Mad Libs are, right? Where it's a paragraph and there's words that are taken out and you have to guess what the right word is. Your ability to read that and insert the right word is just as much a correlate of reading comprehension as oral reading fluency. Okay, so when I have a non-speaking individual, someone who's not able to orally read because of whatever reason, I see if they can do a maze activity or a close assessment. It's spelled that way. I spelled it wrong. Whoops. Close, like that. C-L-O-Z-E. Okay. The other thing is that we can do things called a developmental spelling test. So a developmental spelling test, okay, allows you to, I can't hear you orally read words and decode them, but a developmental spelling test lets me see where you are. Continue using. So for instance, am I frozen again?
Just a little.
I'm going to stop my video. I'm going to see if that helps.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So if I type it, if the word is monster that you want me to spell, and I just put in, J-K-I, that's random letters. Mm-hmm. But if I put an M-T, word monster, that's semi-phonetic. Mm-hmm. If I put in, and that's
You're breaking up again, Dr. Spadorcia.
So,
such a bummer.
I'm so sorry. Can you hear me?
Now we can. Yeah, you're kind of going in and out.
Yeah. So my recommendations would be to do to look at a developmental.
We keep losing her. We keep losing you. I'm wondering if you could dial in from phone.
Okay, let me try that. Hold on 1 minute. Hold on.
Hang on, I'm gonna give you the dial in real quick. Sorry, everyone. I do want to, we have time for a few more questions, so I want to make sure that let me do this. Send this to her as well. All right, let's see if that works. The best laid plans, right? Technology.